Audie Murphy walked off a World War II battlefield at 20 years old carrying 33 military decorations, the Medal of Honor among them, and a country calling him the most decorated American soldier in the history of that conflict. What waited for him on the other side of all that glory was a story nobody wanted to tell. Decades of invisible damage, a Hollywood career built on quiet discipline, and a death in 1971 that the official record filed away as an accident, but that new forensic evidence now points towards something far colder and more deliberate. What actually happened to Audie Murphy, from that sharecropper's farm in Texas to the crash site on Brush Mountain in Virginia, is a story that has never been told completely or honestly, and the closer you look at it, the more troubling it becomes. Kingston, Texas, in the mid-1920s offered very little to the family Murphy was born into on June 20, 1925, the seventh of 12 children raised by Emmett and Josie Belle Murphy on a sharecropping arrangement that left almost nothing after a good season and nothing at all after a bad one. Sharecropping during the Great Depression in rural Texas meant a specific, grinding kind of poverty with no floor beneath it, and Emmett Murphy, the man who should have held the household together, walked out while Audie was still a boy. Josie Belle stayed, worked without stopping, and kept her children alive for as long as she could, and then in 1941, when Murphy was 16, she died. No parents, a fifth-grade education, and a collection of younger siblings entirely dependent on him. That was the inheritance. What nobody expected was that the boy who had been handed all of that weight would carry it without collapsing, pick up whatever work he could find, keep his family fed, and build out of those years a kind of toughness that no military training program could have manufactured or replicated. Enlisting after Pearl Harbor seemed like the obvious move, but the military did not immediately agree. The Marine Corps turned him away for being too small. The Navy did the same. Standing 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing just over 110 pounds, Murphy was an unlikely candidate by any physical standard, and the Army came close to rejecting him as well before giving him the chance he needed. That chance turned out to be one of the more consequential decisions the United States Army made in the entire war. Murphy adapted to combat with a speed that surprised officers who had been in uniform for years before he arrived, moving through campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France with a tactical instincts that were difficult to teach and impossible to fake. He was not reckless. Recklessness gets soldiers killed, and he understood that with the kind of clarity that comes from watching it happen, but he was precise, calm under fire, and capable of reading a battlefield in ways that most soldiers spend careers trying to develop. January 26, 1945, near Holtzwihr in eastern France, was when everything came to its sharpest point. Murphy's company had been reduced to fewer than 20 men, and the Germans came at them with roughly 250 soldiers backed by 6 tanks. After ordering his men back to the tree line, Murphy stayed at the front alone with a radio to direct artillery, and when a tank destroyer nearby caught fire, rather than withdrawing to cover, he climbed on top of the burning vehicle and took control of the .50 caliber machine gun mounted there. For over an hour, wounded in the leg and outgunned by a factor that defied any reasonable calculation of survival, he held that position, fighting the enemy at close range while simultaneously calling in artillery coordinates on the radio, at points directing strikes so close to his own location that any miscalculation would have killed him as surely as the soldiers below. When the Germans finally pulled back, Murphy climbed down from the burning machine, walked back to his men, and led a counterattack to recover the lost ground. The Medal of Honor followed, awarded to a 19-year-old who had just done something that most trained soldiers could not have done at twice his age and with twice his experience. 33 decorations by the end of the war in Europe, including the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with a Valor Device, and 3 Purple Hearts, from the United States and Allied nations combined, making Murphy the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II by a distance that no one has closed since. None of that prepared him for what coming home actually looked like. Life magazine put his photograph on the cover, and the public embraced him with genuine warmth and national pride, and none of it touched what was happening internally. The nightmares came regularly and with force, pulling him back into places and moments he could never fully leave behind. A loaded pistol stayed under his pillow every night. Sudden noises, unexpected movements, anything that broke the predictable surface of civilian life could send him somewhere else entirely, somewhere with no connection to the living room or the street or the people standing in front of him. The military called it battle fatigue, a phrase soft enough to make the thing it described sound manageable. But what Murphy carried home from Europe was what clinicians now identify as post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was severe. What he did with it, though, was something that required its own kind of courage. He talked about it openly, publicly, at a time in American history when that kind of admission from a decorated soldier was essentially unheard of and widely treated as weakness or disqualification. Veterans needed real mental health support, he argued, not dismissal, not silence, not the collective cultural instruction to push through and move on. He was making that argument decades before the culture around him caught up, and the advocacy cost him something in terms of the image the country preferred to project onto him. Hollywood came for him quickly after the war, with actor James Cagney extending a personal invitation after seeing Murphy on the cover of Life magazine. Murphy arrived in California with almost nothing, no money, no training, no connections beyond that single introduction, and spent his early years in the film industry studying the craft with the same focused discipline he had brought to every previous challenge. Progress was slow at first, but the work he put in eventually produced results. His defining role came in 1955 with To Hell and Back, a biographical war film adapted from his own memoir about his wartime service, in which Murphy played himself, an unusual decision for the era and one that paid off commercially in a way the studio had not fully anticipated. The film held the record as Universal Pictures' top-grossing production for years, cemented Murphy's identity as both a genuine American war hero and a viable leading man, and gave audiences something rare in Hollywood biography, a performance by the person who had actually lived the events being depicted, with none of the interpretive distance that acting normally requires. More than 40 films followed across his career, the majority of them westerns and war dramas, with critics sometimes divided on range, but audiences consistently showing up. Something in his screen presence could not be manufactured or coached into existence, and anyone watching closely enough could sense it. In 1957, he appeared in the Western Night Passage alongside James Stewart and Dan Duryea, taking on the role of the Cimarron Kid and holding his own comfortably against two of the most established actors of that generation. Then, 1959 delivered 3 separate performances that collectively demonstrated more range than the Western genre had typically given him room to show. Opposite Sandra Dee in The Wild and The Innocent, Murphy worked from a different emotional register entirely, and behind the scenes on Cast a Long Shadow, he served as an uncredited co-producer alongside Walter Mirisch, demonstrating a professional reach that extended well beyond performing. No Name on the Bullet was the one that critics noticed most, a cold, methodical portrait of a hired killer, stripped of heroism or warmth, and layered with an intensity that surprised people who had categorized him as a straightforward war hero actor. That performance proved he was something more. Working relationships shaped the texture of his career as much as any individual role. Writer Claire Huffaker collaborated with him on 7 Ways from Sundown and Posse from Hell in 1961, both of them solid westerns well matched to Murphy's style. Around the same period, producer Willard W. Willingham and his wife Mary became both professional partners and personal friends, with Willard producing the 1961 television series Whispering Smith and co-writing the screenplay for Battle at Bloody Beach. That partnership extended through the mid-60s and into Bullet for a Bad Man in 1964 and Arizona Raiders in 1965, with the Willinghams later writing the screenplays for both Gunpoint and 40 Guns to Apache Pass in 1967, the film that would mark Murphy's final starring Western lead. He also filmed Trunk to Cairo in Israel in 1966, a departure from American settings that demonstrated a willingness to take on material outside the genre that had defined most of his output. The most lasting creative relationship of his Hollywood years started not on a film set, but in a boxing gym, where Murphy had approached director Bud Budisher and asked to spar with him at Terry Hunt's athletic club in Los Angeles. That encounter sparked a working friendship that lasted nearly 20 years and produced some of the more interesting work of Murphy's career, beginning with The Cimarron Kid in 1951 and culminating in A Time for Dying, the final film Murphy completed, for which Budisher wrote the screenplay. 2 additional projects they planned together, A Horse for Mr. Barnum and When There's Something to Do, never reached production, and that unfinished business represents one of the quieter losses in a life that contained much larger ones. Television gave him additional reach. A 1960 appearance on Startime alongside Thelma Ritter demonstrated ease in a medium that was still finding its audience, and across 3 episodes of the United States Army's The Big Picture series, Murphy lent his credibility and public standing to military communications efforts that earned him the Outstanding Civilian Service Medal in 1960. One episode, Broken Bridge, took him to military installations across Germany, Italy, Turkey, and the American Southwest in New Mexico, blending his celebrity with genuinely substantive content. Away from screens entirely, he wrote music, with several country and western songs he composed getting recorded by artists including Dean Martin and Charlie Pride, a creative dimension that rarely gets mentioned alongside his military and acting careers, but that reflected the full range of a person who was considerably more layered than his public image suggested. Murphy's personal life carried its own turbulence alongside all of it. His 1949 marriage to actress Wanda Hendricks attracted heavy media attention. She was a recognizable Hollywood figure with a rising career of her own, and the combination of her profile and his war hero status made their relationship a constant subject of public interest. The pressures of that visibility combined with Murphy's severe and largely unmanaged PTSD made the marriage difficult from early on, and after 2 years they divorced in 1951. 4 days after that divorce finalized, Murphy married Pamela Opal Lee Archer, a former airline stewardess whose calm and grounded character offered something his life had rarely given him access to: genuine steadiness. 2 sons came from that marriage, Terry Michael in 1952 and James Shannon a few years later, and Pamela functioned as more than a wife across the years that followed. She was the consistent human anchor in a life that had always run on disruption, someone who understood that the man she had married carried wounds that would never fully close and chose to stay anyway. Whatever peace Murphy managed to find in his later years had her at the center of it. May 28, 1971 ended with a twin-engine Aero Commander aircraft going down in heavy fog near Brush Mountain in Catawba, Virginia, with no survivors. Murphy was 45 years old. Pilot error, poor visibility, a tragic accident in difficult mountain weather. That was the official determination, filed quickly and treated as closed. The country mourned. Murphy received full military honors and burial at Arlington National Cemetery, and his grave went on to become one of the most visited in that cemetery, second only to that of President John F. Kennedy. The official story was clean and final, and, it turned out, not complete. Questions emerged in the years that followed, fed by details the accident narrative never adequately explained. The flight path into terrain that dangerous, the specific information given to the pilot about weather conditions, the absence of certain pieces of wreckage from the documented recovery, None of these elements received the scrutiny they deserved in 1971, and Murphy's financial difficulties in the years before his death, along with his long-standing connections to government figures that stretched back through his Hollywood career, gave the unanswered questions somewhere to go. But without concrete evidence, the file stayed closed and the accident narrative held. A team of independent investigators recently undertook a systematic reinvestigation of the crash, working with forensic methods that did not exist in 1971 and examining declassified government documents that had not previously been connected to the case. What the forensic analysis of recovered wreckage fragments produced was evidence of tampering with the aircraft's control systems, wiring that had been cut and rerouted in a pattern inconsistent with impact damage and consistent with deliberate interference performed before the plane left the ground. The positioning and deterioration of the compromised wiring did not match what crash forces produce, and that distinction matters enormously. New interviews with individuals who had stayed silent for decades added another layer to what the physical evidence suggested, with one former official describing surveillance operations directed at Murphy in the months before the crash and making specific claims about sensitive information Murphy had come across. Information connected to covert government operations during the Cold War period that certain powerful interests could not afford to have circulating through a man of his public visibility, credibility, and connections. Murphy was not someone who could be easily discredited. A man carrying his military record, his public standing, his relationships with veterans communities and the press represented a genuine problem to anyone with something to hide. And the account provided to investigators described exactly that calculation being made about him. He had become a liability, and the crash was designed to look like the kind of tragic accident that closes questions rather than opens them. That it succeeded for 50 years is part of what makes the discovery so disturbing. Murphy's family spent those 5 decades with the accident version as their only available truth. His sons grew up inside that narrative. Confronted now with what the investigation has produced, they are calling for a full public inquiry, for the case to be reopened properly, conducted with transparency, and concluded without the institutional pressure that buried the questions the first time. Military historians are revisiting his final years with different eyes, and the broader conversation about Cold War America, about Hollywood's entanglement with government agencies across that era, and about what happened to public figures who stepped too close to certain sensitive lines, is being forced open again in ways it has not been for decades. The complete truth about what happened on that Virginia mountainside may never be entirely recovered, but what has surfaced is enough to make the simple accident story impossible to maintain, and enough to demand something better for the man it concerns. Murphy survived campaigns across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. He stood alone on a burning vehicle at 19 years old and held off 200 soldiers because his country needed him to. He came home damaged and talked about it honestly when honesty cost him something, and he spent decades trying to give other veterans the support and acknowledgement they deserved. That man deserved better than the childhood handed to him, better than the wars he was sent to fight, better than the silence that followed him back from Europe, and far better than what the evidence now suggests ended his life on a foggy Virginia hillside in 1971. Stopping looking away is the least that can be done,